Fast food, the phrase conjures images of neon lights, drive-thrus, and sizzling fryers. Yet, what if we told you that this concept, which we so often frame as a symbol of the modern industrial age, is far older than McDonald's, Burger King, or the 20th century itself? In fact, the roots of fast food trace back not just centuries, but nearly a millennium, to the bustling medieval cities of Europe. In those crowded and chaotic streets, where poverty and wealth brushed shoulders, the majority of ordinary citizens didn't cook their own meals at home. Instead, they turned to a thriving industry of public cookshops, vendors, and mobile stalls. The medieval world's answer to fast food. Records from 13th century France reveal a cityscape alive with the cries of sellers. A French author, Guillaume de Villeneuve, captured this vivid reality in his work The Cries of Paris. He listed the foodstuffs that filled the air with both scent and sound. Steaming bowls of mashed peas, piping hot meat pies, tangy garlic sauce, and cheeses from Champagne and Brie. Alongside these savory dishes came sweets carried by street vendors, who moved through the city with baskets draped in white napkins. They offered wafers, waffles, and rissoles, pastries that could be savory or sweet, and which today we might compare to the portable snacks at any street corner. Imagine a rissole stuffed with figs, apples, and nuts. In many ways, it was the medieval equivalent of a McDonald's apple pie. But to understand medieval fast food, we must look beyond the ingredients and recipes. This wasn't just about convenience. It was about survival. Cooking at home was a privilege, not a norm. In fact, tax records from the English city of Colchester in 1301 show that only 3% of households had a kitchen. Most families lived in cramped quarters, with nothing more than a hearth, and rarely owned pots or pans. The idea of a home-cooked meal was a luxury few could afford. Instead, the cookshops became lifelines, feeding entire cities with a mix of nourishment and indulgence. Still, the food served in these shops reflected social divides. Most vendors catered to commoners, selling affordable stews, beans, or cheap pies. But some targeted wealthier patrons with imported spices, sugar, and rare meats. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves had traveled thousands of miles along the Silk Road, passing through Arab, Persian, and Venetian hands before reaching Western Europe. Their price was astronomical, in some cases worth more than gold by weight. And yet, their presence in a pie or sauce could elevate an otherwise humble dish into a status symbol. Here lies the first fascinating tension of medieval fast food. It was both an equalizer and a divider. On one hand, it democratized access to prepared food. Even a laborer, earning just a few pennies a day, could purchase a simple hot pie. On the other, the inclusion of exotic spices in wealthier cookshops highlighted the widening gap between rich and poor. This wasn't just cuisine. It was economics and geopolitics on a plate. Consider saffron, a flower painstakingly cultivated for its vivid threads. Unlike cinnamon or pepper, saffron was not exclusively an import. It was grown in parts of Spain, France, and England. Still, harvesting it required back-breaking labor. Tens of thousands of flowers for a single pound. Its vibrant yellow dye not only flavored food, but also signaled refinement and wealth. Using saffron in pastry dough, for example, was as much about appearance as taste. A medieval form of culinary branding. The broader story here is not only about what people ate, but also how food became a stage where Europe's economic and political ties were tested. Each rissole or spiced pie contained within it the history of global trade. Sugar came from plantations in the Mediterranean and, later, the Middle East. Cinnamon and nutmeg traced back to the Maluku Islands in present-day Indonesia, changing hands countless times through networks controlled by merchants and empires. These routes were dangerous, costly, and fiercely contested, sparking wars, monopolies, and rivalries. To bite into a medieval risol was, unknowingly, to participate in this vast geopolitical struggle. And yet, on the ground in medieval cities, the scene looked far more ordinary, and at times desperate. Public cookshops were rarely glamorous. Many were little more than stalls or carts set up along streets, known as kukro. Some were equipped with mobile ovens, designed to churn out small pies on the go. A traveler might purchase a quick hot meal before boarding a ship, while a family might bring raw meat to a cook and pay him to bake it into a pie. For wealthier households, these shops offered another kind of convenience. When guests arrived unannounced, a host could order ready-made delicacies instead of waiting hours for servants to prepare a feast. In this light, medieval fast food wasn't a novelty. It was infrastructure, as vital to city life as roads, markets, or even churches. And just like today's fast food chains, these cookshops carried reputations. Some infamous for cutting corners, others respected for quality. Regulations sprang up, and so did scandals. Tales of rancid pies and dishonest vendors appeared in court records, sometimes resulting in punishments as public as the food itself. We often assume fast food is a symbol of modernity, cheap, uniform, and industrial. But the truth is, its foundations were laid centuries earlier, in a Europe grappling with poverty, trade, and survival. In those smoky medieval streets, where spices from Asia collided with apples from local orchards, and where public cooks stood as both saviors and suspects, the origins of fast food were forged. This is not just culinary history. It is a mirror of how societies adapt when faced with scarcity, inequality, and the demands of urban life. The medieval cookshop was, in many ways, the ancestor of the fast food empire. A world where convenience, cost, and class intersected in every bite. The risol, that humble hand pie of the Middle Ages, deserves more attention than it usually receives. At first glance, it was nothing more than a pocket-sized pastry stuffed with sweet or savory fillings. Yet, within its golden crust lay a fascinating story of class, creativity, and global commerce. Recipes for risoles appear in the 14th century French text, La de Paris, a guidebook of household management written for the wife of a wealthy Parisian. Some recipes called for pork mixed with spices. Others featured chestnuts and eggs, beef marrow, or fish like pike and eel. These were the savory versions, affordable only to those who had access to meat. But another style of risol leaned toward the luxurious, filled with figs, raisins, roasted apples, nuts, and dusted with sugar and spices. That sweeter version, glowing with saffron-tinted pastry, was a direct reflection of the era's deepening love affair with exotic flavors. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, nutmeg from the Banda Islands, and cloves from the Moluccas were worth their weight in silver, while sugar, cultivated on Mediterranean plantations, was both a rarity and a revelation. A risol containing these ingredients was more than food. It was edible wealth. To bite into one was to experience not just sweetness, but status. A way for the urban elite to signal refinement in a society where appearance carried immense weight. The presence of these spices in everyday cookshops may seem surprising. After all, weren't these ingredients prohibitively expensive? The answer is complex. On one hand, spices were indeed precious. often transported across thousands of miles and controlled by monopolistic trading powers like Venice and later Portugal. On the other hand, by the late Middle Ages, the volume of trade had grown enough that small quantities became available to the upper middle class. A pastry baker might stretch his supply of cinnamon by blending it with local substitutes, or sell miniature spiced pies as luxury treats. In this way, even ordinary citizens could occasionally taste the faraway world beyond Europe, if only for a few copper coins. Saffron deserves special mention here. Unlike nutmeg or cinnamon, saffron could be cultivated closer to home. In fact, fields in Spain, southern France, and even parts of England grew the delicate crocus flower from which saffron threads are painstakingly harvested. Still, its production was so labor-intensive that saffron remained costly. Tens of thousands of blossoms were required to yield a single pound. In recipes like those for rissoles, saffron wasn't just about taste. It was about color, that brilliant golden hue that made food appear richer, more refined, more alive. In medieval Europe, where presentation was as important as flavor, a bright yellow crust was a subtle declaration of affluence. Yet the cultural meaning of these foods stretched far beyond the kitchen. They reflected a continent caught between subsistence and aspiration. For the vast majority of urban poor, sugar and saffron were dreams they could smell but not taste. Their meals at cookshops were often little more than boiled peas, coarse bread, or pies filled with cheaper cuts of meat. Meanwhile, the wealthy classes could indulge in dishes enhanced with imported flavors, and by doing so, they were participating in a vast web of global trade, stretching from the Far East to the Mediterranean. A rissole, then, was not just a pastry. It was a material connection to the spice road, a route shaped by merchants, wars, piracy, and empires. Take cinnamon as an example. Harvested in Sri Lanka and transported across the Indian Ocean, it passed through Arab traders, Persian markets, and Venetian galleys before finally reaching Paris or London. Each hand it passed added cost, until even a small pouch of cinnamon sticks represented a fortune. Or consider nutmeg, which came from the Banda Islands, so remote that European explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries risked storms and death simply to secure a monopoly. Every medieval cook who sprinkled nutmeg into a rissole was unknowingly part of this global tug-of-war. But it wasn't only the ingredients that mattered. It was also the perception of fast food itself. Modern audiences may find it ironic that in a world without refrigerators or industrial ovens, medieval Europe had a thriving takeout culture. Yet that culture thrived precisely because urban infrastructure demanded it. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, where cramped housing left little room for hearths or kitchens, public cookshops became indispensable. They weren't merely conveniences, they were survival mechanisms. Still, as with today's fast food industry, questions of quality and safety loomed large. Recipes like the saffron-tinted rissole reveal an aspiration toward sophistication, but city records also remind us of the risks. Food spoilage was rampant. Without refrigeration, meats went bad quickly, and dishonest vendors sometimes tried to mask the taste with heavy spices or sugar. Regulations had to be imposed, and violators were punished harshly. To sell rancid pies wasn't just bad business. It was seen as a crime against the community, sometimes resulting in public humiliation at the pillory. This tension between necessity and danger is what gave medieval cookshops their paradoxical reputation. On one hand, they were essential, the only way many citizens could access warm meals. On the other, they were distrusted, associated with spoiled food, dishonest cooks, and questionable hygiene. Literature from the period captures this distrust. Geoffrey Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales paints the portrait of a cook whose pastries are soggy, whose sauces are foul, and who is plagued by an open wound. A caricature, yes, but one grounded in a broader cultural suspicion of fast food vendors. And yet, despite this suspicion, the demand was unrelenting. Wealthy or poor, citizen or traveler, everyone at some point turned to the cookshops. Even knights and nobles relied on them when traveling. As records show, consider Sir Roger Leybourne and his party of knights, who, upon arriving in Canterbury in 1267, immediately purchased 68 capon pies from a local shop. Here we see another critical dimension of medieval fast food: scalability. Cookshops weren't just serving the lone labourer. They could, when required, produce massive quantities of food for weddings, funerals, or guild banquets. In effect, they became the caterers of their age, operating at scales surprisingly similar to modern fast food franchises, handling bulk orders. The rissole, then, is not merely a curiosity of medieval cuisine. It represents the collision of local necessity and global ambition, of poor citizens' reliance and elites' indulgence, of ordinary sustenance and extraordinary aspiration. Each bite contained not only apples and figs, but also centuries of trade, exploitation, and cultural exchange. It is here in the quiet resilience of these small pastries that we glimpse the true complexity of medieval fast food. A system born of survival, but shaped by the same economic and geopolitical forces that continue to define our food today. If the rissole symbolized medieval culinary ambition, then the laws surrounding cookshops revealed just how precarious that ambition could be. By the late 13th and 14th centuries, municipal authorities in Europe had grown increasingly concerned about the dangers posed by spoiled food and dishonest vendors. Without refrigeration, a piece of meat might turn rancid within hours, especially in the summer heat. Fish and poultry were even riskier. For ordinary people relying on these shops, the line between nourishment and food poisoning was frighteningly thin. The solution was regulation. Though medieval regulation often came with a theatrical flair, city officials conducted periodic inspections of cookshops, pie sellers, and bakers, sometimes accompanied by beadles or sergeants to enforce compliance. If the food was found unwholesome, stinking fish, rotten pies, stale capons, the punishment was not just a fine. The guilty cook might be hauled before the community and subjected to public humiliation. In London, for instance, an offending pie seller could be forced to stand in the pillory, surrounded by jeering crowds, while his offending wares were destroyed before his eyes. The message was clear. Food safety was not merely a private matter, but a communal concern. Such punishments may strike us as harsh, but they reflected the essential role food vendors played in urban life. If bread or pies were unsafe, entire neighborhoods could suffer. This is why records from cities like London and Paris are filled with complaints about unwholesome foods, and why the authorities treated such offenses almost like crimes against public health. Food poisoning could be deadly in an age without antibiotics. A spoiled pie wasn't just unpleasant, it was potentially fatal. Literature of the time gleefully echoed these anxieties. Chaucer's cook, as mentioned earlier, is a grotesque caricature. A man whose ulcer drips into the sauce, whose pies are soggy, whose kitchen reeks of neglect. He embodies the cultural suspicion of fast food vendors, a suspicion rooted in real concerns. Writers used cooks as symbols of corruption, greed, and physical decay. When readers laughed at Chaucer's cook, they weren't just laughing at a character. They were recognizing the uncomfortable truth that the cookshops they relied upon might be feeding them danger. Court cases add further detail. In 14th century London, One infamous case involved a group of pie sellers accused of padding their products with questionable fillings, spoiled meat, excessive fat, even scraps of offal unfit for consumption. They were brought before the mayor's court, fined heavily, and some were placed in the pillory. The spectacle wasn't just punishment, it was performance. A reminder to every cook in the city that cheating customers could destroy not just reputations but livelihoods. And yet, despite these risks, cook shops thrived. Why? Because urban life demanded them. Few city dwellers had the facilities to cook daily meals at home, and even fewer could afford the time. For apprentices, students, and laborers, the cook shop was as necessary as the bakery or the water cellar. The question wasn't whether to eat there, but how to navigate the dangers wisely. Some strategies emerge in the records. Customers often relied on trust, returning to vendors whose food had proved safe before, avoiding unknown sellers, and judging pies not by their fillings but by their crusts, which offered a clue to freshness. Wealthier citizens sent servants to sample food before purchasing in bulk, using them as an early warning system. In guild banquets or large events, where the stakes were higher, cooks with proven reputations were contracted. And records suggest their names were known and valued in the community. In effect, medieval cooks operated on a spectrum. From shady street vendors, mocked by poets, to respected professionals capable of feeding knights, mayors, and bishops. This brings us back to the paradox of medieval fast food. It was both indispensable and distrusted. Everyone used it, but no one fully trusted it. Its regulation was necessary, yet never enough. It was mocked in literature, policed in law, and yet, like the modern hamburger chain or street vendor, it flourished because it met a need no society could ignore. Seen this way, the cook shop becomes less a relic of the past and more a mirror of our own food culture. Then, as now, questions of convenience, safety, and trust shaped what people ate. The saffron-stained rissole, the humble capon pie, even the much-maligned puddings, all were part of a system that allowed cities to function, even if they left behind a reputation both fascinating and faintly suspicious. To truly appreciate medieval cook shops, we must hold them up against their modern descendants. Fast food chains. At first glance, the two worlds could not be more different. One operated in narrow, cobbled alleys under the shadow of Gothic cathedrals. The other spreads across neon-lit highways and glass storefronts. One relied on hand pies stuffed with pike or figs. The other serves burgers wrapped in branded paper. And yet, beneath the surface, the parallels are striking. Convenience as the core value. The essence of fast food has always been speed and accessibility. For medieval townsfolk, the cook shop was the quickest way to fill an empty stomach between working hours or during travel. Customers could grab a hot pie, a roasted bird, or a rissole without spending hours at a hearth. Likewise, the modern drive-through or delivery app fulfills the same role for today's harried commuter. The promise hasn't changed. You don't have to cook, we'll do it for you. Scale and standardization. Consider Sir Roger Laban's Knights in Canterbury, ordering 68 capon pies in a single day. That was bulk catering by any standard, and it highlights how cook shops could scale up their operations when necessary. Reputation and branding. In the absence of neon logos, medieval cooks had only their names and reputations. A trustworthy cook might become the go-to supplier for guild banquets, weddings, or noble feasts. A dishonest one could be ruined overnight by a single spoiled pie, sometimes literally ruined in public. At the pillory today, branding has replaced personal reputation. A golden arch, a red and white bucket, or a clown mascot communicates safety or at least predictability to customers. Medieval cooks could not trademark a logo, but their good name was every bit as powerful as a modern brand. Regulation and scandals, food safety scandals, are not unique to our age of viral news stories. In the 14th century, London courts were filled with cases of bakers shorting loaves, brewers watering beer, and cooks disguising rotten meat with spices. The punishments, public humiliation, destruction of goods, and fines mirror today's recalls, lawsuits, and viral outrage when a fast food chain is caught cutting corners. Both systems operate under the same tension. Customers demand cheap, quick meals, but society demands safety and trust. Cultural suspicion, perhaps the most striking similarity, is psychological. Both medieval cookshops and modern fast food occupy a curious space in the public imagination, simultaneously beloved and distrusted. In Chaucer's day, cooks were mocked as unhygienic charlatans, even as their shops remained crowded. Today, fast food is scorned as unhealthy junk. Yet, billions of burgers are eaten annually. The paradox is timeless. People need convenience, but they worry about what convenience costs. Global trade and exoticism. The risoles filled with saffron, figs, and cinnamon were the medieval equivalent of today's limited edition or exotic flavor fast food releases. Just as a modern chain might roll out a wasabi burger or a pumpkin spice latte to intrigue customers, medieval cooks used spices from the Far East to signal luxury and novelty. Both reveal a marketing instinct as old as commerce. Turn the foreign and rare into something exciting and profitable for everyday consumers. In short, medieval cookshops were not just quaint curiosities, but early prototypes of an enduring business model. They thrived on convenience, scaled for demand, relied on reputation, endured regulation, courted suspicion, and exploited global trade. The golden arches of McDonald's may seem far removed from the golden saffron crust of a risotto, but they belong to the same lineage of human need and ingenuity.